The widow of Ravenel House tried to leave part of her plantation to a man the law said was property. The South called it madness. They never asked what drove her there. Charleston, 1846. 3 miles beyond the city, where the road turns to sand and the air grows heavy with salt and rot, Ravenel House watched the marshlands like a pale 2-story ghost. 6 white columns, wraparound porch, windows that caught every bit of gossip the tide could carry inland. By day, it looked like money. By night, it looked like a secret. For decades, the Ravenel name meant respect. Jonathan Ravenel owned ships, rice fields, and the kind of influence that made judges stand up a little straighter when he walked into a room. When he died at 48, the church bells in Charleston rang too long, and the procession to Magnolia Cemetery stretched so far, people said it looked like the city itself was following him to the grave. Beside the coffin walked his wife, Lydia, 26, childless, wrapped in black from throat to wrist. The women whispered about her as the moss shifted in the river breeze. Poor thing. Too young, too alone, too much money and no heir. They saw a fragile widow. They did not see the decision already forming behind her eyes. On paper, Jonathan's death was simple. Apoplexy, the doctor wrote, a word that meant everything and explained nothing. One evening, he was at the head of his table, skin flushed with drink, complaining about tariffs. The next morning, he was on his back on the bedroom floor, face turned to the ceiling, mouth twisted open as if still trying to argue with God. The body went into stone. The estate went into probate, and Lydia Ravenel went into a role the city believed it understood. For a few weeks, she played it perfectly. Curtains drawn, guests received in low light, thank you notes written in a hand that trembled just enough. Then, 2 weeks after the funeral, she sent a carriage for Jonathan's attorney. Silas Boone expected tears. Instead, he found Lydia waiting in the front parlor with the shutters open, sunlight cutting sharp lines across the rug, her mourning dress buttoned all the way to the throat, her voice steady. She did not ask about her allowance. She did not ask how long she was expected to stay out of society. She asked how to free one man. Moses. In the inventory Jonathan left behind, Moses was listed between a pair of mules and a wagon. Male, about 30, house servant, literate, $1,050. On the land, he was something far more complicated. He kept the household accounts. He carried keys. He moved between pantry and library with the quiet assurance of someone who knew exactly how fragile everything around him really was. Most enslaved people at Ravenel House slept in cramped quarters beyond the kitchen yard. Moses slept in a narrow room built into the side of the library, connected to the main house by a covered passage so Lydia could call for books without stepping into the rain. Jonathan liked to boast that he owned a servant who could quote Milton and balance ledgers in the same afternoon. What he never understood, or never wanted to see, was that someone else in that house had begun to need more than his clever party trick. Lydia told Silas Boone she wanted Moses freed. Not rented out, not sold to a kinder master. Free. And not just that, she wanted him written into the estate, a beneficiary. Boone's pen stopped over his notebook. In South Carolina law, what she was asking for wasn't just scandalous. It was near impossible. The statutes were clear. Any enslaved person freed had to leave the state or risk being seized again. Property could not legally pass to someone the law refused to see as a full person. Lydia knew all that. She had read the codes herself. She had marked the pages. Still, she sat there in that too-quiet room, hands folded in her lap, and told the family lawyer of one of Charleston's oldest names that part of Ravenel wealth was going to a man who slept off the library. Silas tried every argument he had. Reputation, safety, the legislature, her own future. He warned that people would question her mind, her morals, her very sanity. Lydia listened. Then she said very calmly, "It was Jonathan's wish." That was the first lie, because not even the dead man in the marble tomb had been ready for what she was about to do. And the clerk down at the county office, the first outsider to see the paper trail she was trying to carve through stone, would write in his private journal that Mrs. Ravenel had either lost her senses or discovered something so terrible she no longer cared who tried to stop her. The clerk down at the county office saw it first. A widow asking to free a man like Moses and name him in the same breath as land, coin, and ships. He logged the papers, swallowed his questions, and that night wrote in his private journal that Mrs. Lydia Ravenel had either lost her mind or found a conscience too large for this county to tolerate. Silas Boone did what men like him always did when the world tilted. He tried to push it back upright. He called at Ravenel House 3 days later, papers in hand, polite outrage polished to a shine. He spoke of consequences, of legislature and precedent, of how quickly a woman alone could be turned into a spectacle, of how neighbors might talk if they saw a name like Moses appear anywhere other than an inventory list. Lydia listened from the edge of the parlor light, hands folded, face unreadable. When he finished, he waited for her to crumble. She did not. "I understand the risks," she said. "You don't," he answered, "or you wouldn't be entertaining this fantasy." Silas paused, chose his next blade carefully. "There are already rumors, Mrs. Ravenel, about your sympathies, about the time you spend in the library, about who is summoned there when the master is away." That landed. Not because it was new, because it said aloud what had only lived in half-finished sentences behind shut doors. Lydia's jaw tightened. "Moses," she said slowly, "kept my husband's house running when Jonathan forgot it existed. He balanced your accounts when you were too tired to read your own numbers. He sat with me through fevers your doctor called nerves and prescribed laudanum for." She leaned forward. "He is not a rumor. He is a person, and I will not let his life be buried with Jonathan's ledgers." Silas saw then that he had already lost his case, not in court, in this room. So he shifted tactics. If he could not move Lydia, he could move someone else. Within a week, Jonathan's cousin, Robert Ravenel, rode up the drive, hat still on when he crossed the threshold. He did not bother with condolences. He went straight to accusation. "You mean to ruin this family," he said. They were in Jonathan's old study now, the air thick with cigar smoke and old arguments. Robert stood. Lydia sat in her late husband's chair, back straight, black dress a stark line against the dark wood. "You are not a Ravenel by blood," Robert continued. "You are here because Jonathan took pity on a girl from Beaufort with a decent name and no dowry. This house, this land, this name, they are not yours to gamble on some misguided fancy about a slave." The word cracked between them. Lydia did not flinch. She only answered with something far more dangerous than anger. Calm. "I am not gambling," she said. "I am correcting." Robert laughed once, sharp and humorless. "Correcting what? God's order?" Outside, the marsh wind scraped against the shutters. Inside, Lydia chose her next sentence like a woman stepping off a ledge. "What Jonathan did to that man," she said quietly, "was never order." Robert stopped laughing. For a moment, he just stared. Somewhere in that silence, a thought he had refused to entertain finally forced itself into shape. Too much time in the library. Too much protection from the mistress. Too much ease in a house built on unease. His eyes hardened. "If you continue down this path," he said, I will have the court declare you unfit to manage this estate. They will say you are influenced, confused, unsound. He did not have to say by whom. The shadow of Moses's name hung in the room between them. 2 days later, papers bearing Robert Ravenel's signature landed on a judge's desk in Charleston. They asked for 3 things: an injunction freezing Lydia's control of the estate, an inquiry into her mental fitness, and a halt to any sale, manumission, or removal of valuable property from Ravenel lands. By the time word of this reached Lydia, the law was already moving faster than grief. She did not cry. She did not plead. She went to the only person in Charleston who might understand that her request was not madness, but strategy. Elias Mercer had arrived from the north 5 years earlier, a lawyer with frayed cuffs and unwelcome ideas about what human beings could or could not own. Planters hired him to smooth over shipping disputes, then whispered that he kept dangerous company. Abolitionist, they said under their breath, the word tasting like smoke and ash. When Lydia stepped into his narrow office near the docks, Mercer looked up from his papers and saw more than a widow. He saw risk. "You understand what they're already calling you," he said after she explained. "Let them name me what they like," Lydia replied. "I am asking what can be done." Mercer leaned back, studied her. "You're not the first woman to feel pity for a man in chains," he said. "What makes this different?" The question was simple. The answer was not. Lydia's fingers tightened on the edge of her shawl. She could have said, "He is educated. He is loyal. He is the only person in this house who sees me as more than a decoration nailed to the front porch." Instead, she said the one thing that was both true and safe enough to speak in a stranger's office. "He deserves a life that is not owned by the people who destroyed it." Mercer nodded slowly. "All right," he said. "There may be a way. Not through Charleston, through New York. Through papers meant for cargo, not for people. It will mean lies on ledgers and names that do not belong to you. And if we are caught, they will call you more than unsound." He met her eyes. "They will call you criminal." Lydia did not look away. "I have already been called worse," she said. Outside, in the registry office, the clerk added another line to his private journal. The widow of Ravenel House had dismissed the family lawyer, taken up with a man known to be sympathetic to abolitionists, and showed no sign of bending. He ended the entry with a sentence that would look almost prophetic years later. "If this is madness, it is the kind that makes men do desperate things to stop it." The law did not come to Ravenel House with chains and guns. It came with a doctor and a pen. Judge Holloway did not yet dare strip Lydia of everything, not on rumor, not while Charleston eyes were still trained on the Ravenel morning. So he chose the more polite weapon, an examination. Dr. Caroline Finch rode out on a gray morning, medicine bag at her feet, court papers folded inside like another kind of instrument. She had seen this before. Women labeled unreasonable, inconvenient, or simply too awake for the comfort of the men around them. Sometimes they truly were adrift. Sometimes they were the only sane person in the room. At Ravenel House, Lydia met her in the front hall, thin in her black dress, eyes clear in a way that unnerved both allies and enemies. They spoke in the small sitting room that smelled of lemon oil and old smoke. Dr. Finch asked about sleep, appetite, grief. Lydia answered honestly enough. She dreamed often. She ate when she remembered. Grief, she said, was less a storm than a low tide dragging everything slowly out to sea. Finch made notes, noted the steadiness of Lydia's voice, the precision with which she discussed estate accounts, shipments, crop yields. Then she asked the question every person in Charleston wanted attached to an official seal. Why Moses? Lydia's hands, resting on the arm of her chair, tightened just once. "He kept me from going mad long before anyone thought to send a doctor," she said. "Is that affection?" Finch asked gently. "Gratitude?" Lydia looked toward the window, where the marsh grass bent under the wind. "It is recognition," she said. "Of what?" Lydia turned back. "Of a man who deserved better than the life my husband built on his back." Finch wrote for a long time after that. Her report, when it reached Judge Holloway's desk, was careful. "Mrs. Ravenel is lucid," she wrote, "organized in thought, and fully aware of the consequences of her proposed actions. She displays no signs of mental disease, but a troubling disregard for established social order. Her attachment to certain household servants, particularly one Moses, borders on inappropriate in the eyes of our community, though not, in my view, on insanity. She signed it knowing what those words would do. They would not protect Lydia. They would only remove one excuse for what was coming." The injunction hardened. Lydia kept her house and her black dresses. Robert Ravenel took the ledger keys. Ships, fields, accounts. And Moses? He stayed on the property, on paper at least, moving through the halls like a man walking a burning building, never sure which floor would give way first. The plan with Elias Mercer did not die. It simply went quieter. Codes appeared in letters sent north. Cargo lists with wrong numbers hiding one extra body among crates of rice and timber. Talk of a bookkeeper needed in New York that never mentioned a face or color. They were close enough to taste a world where Moses would step off a ship not as property, but as a man. Then, one July morning, he was gone. The boy who brought wood to the library found his bed neatly made, his few clothes folded, his worn copy of Paradise Lost open on the table to a passage about chains. No one had seen him leave. No one admitted to helping. Word raced through the house, leapt the fields, hit Robert Ravenel like a thrown stone. Within hours he had the sheriff at the door. They searched the property first. Barns, quarters, the strip of woods between the house and the marsh. Dogs took his scent near the back gate, followed it through the pines, then lost it at the edge of the tidal flats, where pluff mud swallowed tracks and secrets whole. Robert was livid. To him, the story was easy. The widowed mistress, the northern lawyer, the rogue servant slipping toward a life he did not deserve. He demanded a search party. Men saddled horses. Guns were loaded. Dogs called again. They rode into heat so thick it sat on the skin like another layer of clothing. The marsh gaped open in front of them, green and shining and deadly. For 3 days they combed the creeks and hammocks, cursing bugs and mud and the man whose absence had turned the whole landscape into an accusation. On the 3rd day, a shout went up from a stand of cypress. Moses was found face down in the water, wedged among roots, shirt tangled around his shoulders, wrists marked where something rough had bitten deep. The official report said he had run, stumbled in the dark, become trapped by the tide. In panic and despair, it claimed, he had tied a rope to a low branch and taken his own life rather than be dragged back in chains. It was tidy. It fit the world men like Robert needed to believe in, that some people simply broke when they tried to climb out of the place assigned to them. They brought his body back at dusk. Lydia watched from an upstairs window as men moved below like figures on a stage she could no longer step into. No preacher was called. No stone was ordered. Moses was buried at the edge of Ravenel land, where the dry ground ended and the marsh began, a place meant for things no one wished to remember but could not quite throw away. For 3 days, Lydia did not speak. Not to Eliza the maid who brought her food untouched. Not to Dr. Finch, who rode out again when rumors reached town. Not to Elias Mercer, who waited in his office doorway long after dark, staring at letters that now had nowhere to go. On the fourth day, she called for Rebecca, the only servant who had been with her before Jonathan, before the house, before any of this. They sat in the dim of Lydia's bedroom, curtains half drawn, the air thick with heat and the faint salt of the distant sea. Rebecca tried to offer comfort. Lydia cut her off. "They murdered him," she said. Her voice was hoarse, as if scraped raw by something larger than grief. They murdered him because he knew too much. Rebecca asked who they were. Lydia did not answer. Maybe she could not pick just one name. Robert, who would rather see a man dead than free. Jonathan, whose threats had made escape the only imaginable future. The law that taught everyone which lives were cheap enough to erase. Or maybe she meant something bigger. The whole weight of a world designed so that a man like Moses could know numbers, poetry, love, but never know safety. Outside, the marsh kept its own counsel. Tides came and went, grass bent and rose. Water closed over the spot where Moses had laid as neatly as if nothing extraordinary had happened. On paper, the case was over. Property recovered, order restored, widow stabilized. But in the quiet corners of Ravenel House, a new kind of rumor began. Not about a love affair, about a death that did not look like an accident, and about the possibility that the first Ravenel buried in Magnolia Cemetery that year had not died the way the city believed either. On the courthouse shelves, the story ended with Moses in the marsh and Lydia gone quiet. But history has two lives, one on paper and one in the mouths of people who saw more than they dared to say. Rebecca never forgot Lydia's words. They murdered him because he knew too much. For years, she carried that sentence like a coal in her chest, hot and quiet and impossible to put down. She noticed things others shrugged away. The way Robert Ravenel's eyes never quite met hers when he spoke of the tragedy. The way the sheriff avoided details in his report, calling the scene sufficiently clear, without ever writing what the rope marks on Moses's wrists actually looked like. And, perhaps most unsettling of all, the way Lydia flinched whenever anyone mentioned Jonathan's sudden passing. One evening, months after Moses was buried, Rebecca found Lydia in the library, staring not at the books, but at the empty space where Moses's narrow bed had once stood in the adjoining room. The air smelled of old paper and river damp. Lydia held a small leather notebook in her lap, pages blank. "You should leave this house," Rebecca whispered. Lydia shook her head. "This house is the crime," she said softly. "If I leave it, they will bury what happened here twice over." She opened the notebook. "If they mean to erase us," she murmured, "let them work harder." That was how the second life of the Ravenel story began. Not in court records. In a widow's cramped handwriting, hidden between floorboards and behind bricks, pages that did not care whether judges believed them. Years turned. Robert Ravenel died red-faced over a ledger during a summer heat wave. New cousins took his place. The war came and went, taking ships and sons and the clean edges off Ravenel money. Lydia aged into a figure wrapped in rumor. The mad widow in the East Wing, the one who walked the halls at night, the one children dared each other to glimpse through high windows. She went to church less and less, to the graveyard more and more. On one of those walks, Dr. Finch, older now, hair threaded with silver, caught up with her among the stones. "Do you still believe you're the only sane one in this affair?" the doctor asked quietly. Lydia looked at Jonathan's marble marker, the neat, lying word, apoplexy, chiseled into stone. Then her gaze drifted past it toward the newer grave without a stone, where marsh grass licked at the edge of consecrated ground. "No," she said. "I think sanity left this family long before I arrived." Finch hesitated. Then she said something she had never written in any report. "The night your husband died," she murmured, "his lips were stained darker than wine. I told myself it was nothing. I have been telling myself that ever since." Lydia's hand tightened on her shawl. There it was. The suspicion Moses had once whispered to Rebecca. The fear that kept Lydia awake. Maybe Jonathan had not died by stroke at all. Maybe someone in the house had helped his heart stop beating. Someone with access to the decanters. Someone with motive enough to risk hanging. Or, more dangerously, someone the law would never consider a suspect because it refused to see him as capable of such deliberate action. By the time the century turned, most of the people who had walked Ravenel halls were under stone or marsh or both. The house itself sagged at the edges. The land changed hands, then changed again. Rice fields turned to overgrown strips of green. In Charleston proper, the name Ravenel slid from power into quaint history, something tourists might see etched on plaques without feeling the weight of what it had once done. The papers Lydia wrote did not come out of hiding. Not yet. They waited. In 1965, a graduate student named Claire Hastings stepped into the Charleston County Archives with a thesis proposal about women's legal power in the antebellum South, and a curiosity that would not leave her alone. She had found a stray reference in an old law review. Ravenel versus Ravenel, 1847. Disposition of estate contested on grounds of widow's alleged incompetence. The published summary was thin, too thin. It mentioned an unnamed house servant at the center of the dispute. No details. No outcome, beyond an injunction and a quiet settlement. Claire smelled a story. She asked for the box with the original filings. An older clerk frowned, said the box was probably lost in a flood. She smiled politely, thanked him, and went home annoyed. 3 weeks later, she tried again on a different shift. A younger clerk, less practiced in the art of disappearance, disappeared into the back for a long time, and returned with a dust-coated carton stamped Ravenel. Inside were things that should not have survived so neatly. Robert's petition, Dr. Finch's cautious report, the sheriff's tidy description of Moses's self-destruction, and lodged between them, as if misfiled on purpose, a small leather notebook. Not Lydia's original journal, a copy. Pages written in a different hand, slower, but faithfully transcribing an older voice. Claire read until the lights flickered warning at closing. She read about Jonathan's face turning red at the head of the table, about the way his hand had gone to his throat as if surprised by his own death, about Moses's fear when he learned he might be sold downriver to Separatus, about the pregnancy that had ended in bloody sheets and whispered prayers. She read the line that made her put a hand flat on the table to steady herself. "I did not pour the poison," Lydia had written. I handed him the glass. Claire signed the notebook out under a vague request for further review, took it back to her rented room, and recorded her impressions into a little tape machine she kept for notes. On the last tape, her voice trembled between excitement and something close to dread. "The more I see," she said, "the more clear it is that someone went to great lengths to keep this quiet. This isn't just about a forbidden attachment. It's about murder, and about who gets to write the word natural on a death certificate." She paused. "I'm going out to the old Ravenel property tomorrow. The timber company foreman agreed to meet me at the gate. If Lydia hid anything else, it's there. The tape clicked off. Claire Hastings never made that meeting. Her car was found 2 days later on a sandy service road, door closed, keys gone. No sign of a struggle, no sign of her. The sheriff called it an accident, a city girl wandering off trail into marsh and heat and getting lost. The file closed with the same word that had followed Moses and perhaps Jonathan. Tragic. Claire's advisor, a professor named Dr. Monroe, came to collect her things. He asked for the Ravenel box. The archive staff told him, with bland faces, that no such box existed. Perhaps Miss Hastings had misunderstood. Perhaps she had been working with ship manifests, not court filings. Perhaps grief was making him misremember. Monroe went home unconvinced. Among Claire's belongings, he found the tapes. He found, wrapped in a scarf at the bottom of her suitcase, that small copied notebook. He read Lydia's words by a cheap desk lamp, listened to Claire's voice speaking into the dark of a Carolina motel room, and understood why some stories refuse to die, even when people do. He did not turn the diary over to the county. He drove it north instead. And somewhere between Charleston and the campus, where it would disappear into a private cabinet for decades, the story of Ravenel House slipped out of the official record again, like a body sliding beneath marsh water, waiting for some future low tide to bring it back into the light. When Dr. Monroe opened Lydia's copied diary in his cramped office, he expected guilt. He found something harder to carry: complicity. Lydia did not paint herself as a heroine. Her words were sharp, sometimes cruel, always suspicious of her own memory. 15 years since I lost them both, one entry began. Jonathan, for all his sins, was my husband. Moses was my heart's only companion. Neither death was what the world believes. Both haunt me equally. She wrote of the night Jonathan died, the dinner table, the decanter, the way his hand had trembled as he refilled his glass, laughing too loudly at some joke about tariffs and northern meddling. I remember my hand on his shoulder, she wrote, steadying him as he drank. In every retelling since, I have placed that same hand on the bottle instead, as if my touch alone tipped the poison in. She paused there on the page. Then, I did not pour it. I think now that I never even saw whose hand did. But I handed him the glass. I smiled when he lifted it. I watched his face redden and felt nothing until he fell. Another entry months later. M had written letters I did not know about, to a man in New York whose name I can barely bring myself to write. He begged for help to flee southward sail. He wrote of Jonathan's threats, of the life he feared and the life he could imagine instead. Edward, one of the younger Ravenel men who had taken Robert's place, found those letters after Jay's death. He believes I knew, that I conspired with M to rid myself of a husband and free my lover. He is wrong. The truth is worse. I knew nothing of the letters until the man who loved me was already underwater. Piece by piece, Monroe traced the outline of a crime the law had never named. Had Moses poisoned Jonathan? Lydia never writes the answer clean, but she circles it like a wound she cannot stop touching. He told Rebecca once that a man who owns bodies, words, and futures does not deserve the luxury of a peaceful end, she notes. He said it in anger, but not all anger is a lie. If he did it, she adds in another entry, he did it because Jonathan meant to sell him away from me, because the law gave him no other weapon, because this house offered no path to life that did not travel over someone else's grave. She does not excuse him. She does not condemn him. She simply refuses to let anyone pretend it was an act of madness. It was a decision made in a world that had stripped him of every gentler choice. About her own death, Lydia is more afraid than sentimental. The last pages crackle with unease. She writes of young Thomas Ravenel, Robert's son, returning from studies in Virginia, eyes cold, questions too sharp. He asked about Moses with a curiosity that tasted like accusation, she records. He examined the east wing as if measuring distances. I told Mary to sleep in my dressing room tonight. I do not trust the way he looks at my door. 2 days later, the fire started in that same wing. The official cause was a fallen lamp. The diary does not live long enough to say otherwise. But in its silence, in that sudden break, Monroe heard the same absence that had swallowed Moses, and perhaps Jonathan, a convenient end for a woman who knew too much. Decades after Monroe locked the copy away, the original Ravenel land changed again. Timber crews cut roads through what had once been rice fields. Equipment rolled heavy over soil that remembered chains and bare feet. Workers told stories in the way men on night shifts always have. They spoke of lights flickering near the marsh edge where no generators ran, of the sound of waterlogged rope tightening under unseen weight, of footsteps on old shell paths that stopped when you stepped into the open. Most laughed it off. A few did not. Locals say that on certain humid nights, when the air sits heavy and the mosquitoes fall quiet for just a breath, you can hear 2 sets of footsteps around where Ravenel House used to stand. One, slow and precise, like a woman pacing a corridor she once owned. The other, bare and lighter, like someone who has spent a lifetime walking carefully in another man's world. Some say it's Lydia, still searching for the paper trail that will outlive the ones who burned it. Some say it's Moses, forever reaching for a road that would take him somewhere his name wasn't chained to someone else's. And some say it's neither. They say it's just the truth itself, circling the ruins of a life it was never allowed to occupy fully, waiting for someone to stop, to listen, to understand what really happened in that house. This was never just a story about a widow and her husband's slave. It was about a system that made love a crime, made freedom a trick of paperwork, and made murder easier to hide than compassion. It was about who gets to die with their sins named, and who is buried under words like tragedy and madness and natural causes, so that other people can sleep at night. Ravenel House is gone now. The columns fell, the porch rotted. The name slipped off law firm doors and out of polite conversation. But the land remembers, the river remembers, and somewhere in a locked drawer, Lydia's cramped handwriting still waits for the day someone opens it again, reads her confession that is not quite a confession, and realizes that the most disturbing thing about this story is not the forbidden attachment, but how far the living were willing to go to ensure the dead could never tell it in their own words.